Seawing Disaster. Mr. Johnson? I should put my glasses on. There you are.
I'm going to say one thing before Fred speaks, because he volunteered something ever so graciously when he was upstairs. If you didn't know, he's written quite a few books. This is not the only one. He's actually written 8 books on Minnesota history, and we have several of them sitting upstairs. So if you would be so gracious, if you would like one of those books and you don't have it, he said he would sign it. So if you wish to buy one up there today, many of them are 20% off, and you can buy them and he'll sign them for you. Other than that, I have been working with Fred now for the last couple months to put this on. But what it started with is he's redoing the book. And he came to us talking about it, and I got really excited. And I thought, wow, this would be a really good speaking engagement. I had no idea it would be this good. But a really good speaking engagement. And I am so glad to have him here. And it's been a pleasure working with him over the last few months. So, Fred.
Thanks very much, and I really appreciate the turnout. To see a lot of high school classmates even here. That's interesting. And former basketball teammates and other assorted important personages, former mayors even, I think. So good. It's good to be here. I'm always at home in Red Wing. The Goodhue Co Historical Society is even more a home for me. I'm old enough to remember the original County Historical Society. It was in the county courthouse. I'm betting there's no one else other than my mother-in-law who remembers that. And I used to stop on my way home from Washington School when I was a little kid and visit the collections. Admittedly, I was a strange little kid, but I did actually do that. And I just always had a love for history. My wife, Diane, is here today, and I'm going to introduce her in a minute. We left the city, both of us at the same time, obviously, to teach in St. Paul Public Schools. She was an art teacher, and I taught in elementary grades. We were both high school. We were also high school classmates. She serves as the first editor of anything that I write, and I really appreciate that. She's a very strict one. She is very happy to criticize, which might sound counterproductive, but she does it in a positive way, so things go pretty well. I think I'm going to have her stand now, just to introduce her. Diane. She's a little more about her a little bit when I introduce this garbage bag up here. I would call her the embodiment of the long-suffering wife. We've been married 47 years, and she doesn't look it. I know I do, but it's been a very, very enjoyable, wonderful 47 years. Diane's mother is here, too, and she has a particular relationship to the Seawing Disaster. Two of her aunts, who would have been her aunts, died on the Seawing. The Persig sisters from Hay Creek. And I want you to stand up here. Our vibrant 95, yes, she is 95. Also known as one of Red Wing's most loyal Minnesota Twins fans. She's been in Republican Eagle even featured. Her family got here before Minnesota was a state, so she goes way back. Not quite that far, but her grandfather does. I think most of you are familiar in general with the Seawing, and some I know are Seawing Disaster. Some I expect would know the whole story and have read the book. But for those who haven't, I'll make just a brief synopsis of what happened and why it is so important, just to give you a feel for that. And then I'd like to go on to talk about what we intend to do with the new version of the Seawing Disaster. We're talking about actually an excursion boat that wasn't an excursion boat. The Seawing was a work boat, and sometimes it was used by the captain, David Weathern, as a special excursion boat. And in July of 1890, the Minnesota National Guard was at its camp in Lake City. This is where it was the Camp Ripley of its day, and it was quite the tourist attraction. And we also had, from Red Wing, the Red Wing Company G of the National Guard was down at Camp Lakeview. So Captain Weathern, who lived in Diamond Bluff and also had a store there, the building is still there, decided he'd bring his boat over to Red Wing, get a load of passengers and bring them down to the festivities, the Sunday afternoon festivities at Camp Lakeview. They were going to have military demonstrations, a military band, and all cannon fire, all sorts of interesting things. So he brought the boat through Trenton, picked up people at Trenton. They had about 20 people on board when they came to the Red Wing levee in the morning, about 11 in the morning, and loaded at that time about 150 people. This is a fairly small boat, but he was towing a barge. I shouldn't say it's strapped to the bow of the Seawing, and we didn't know this when I did the first. I later found was given a photo of how it actually looked in 1890. And he had a band on the barge, a three-piece band, and people could cross from the Seawing onto the barge, and they even tried to play dance music. I didn't know how that. Well, I haven't found any good reports on how the dancing went, but it was going to be a festive day, a very happy day. People brought lunches. People down Lake City and the National Guard had things laid out for them. They were selling stuff. They were also giving away food and drink, and it was really a terrific day plan. Things went very well. One of the things that the people expected was possibly some heavy weather. It was a beautiful morning, but it was very hot and humid, and it had been that way for quite a while. And back in St. Paul, if they had the communications that we have today, they might have been hearing that there was a big blow coming. About 2 hours before the Seawing met with its problems, a tornado, which is well known today in St. Paul as the Lake Jarvis tornado, hit just north of the city. And one of the new photos we'll have in the new book is the Lake Jarvis tornado. It's directly related to the Seawing disaster. Can you imagine if you had a tornado like that in today's weather and communications? People down on the lake in Lake City would have heard about it, maybe been a little more concerned when it was time to go home from Lake City. What happened in the afternoon is while their storms were brewing in St. Paul, heavy winds blew through Red Wing and came roll some fields of corn just flat and headed down toward the lake and hit the National Guard camp, bringing a quick end to all of the festivities there. The camps, the company street was just blown apart where the mess tents were and the bigger structures. And everything kind of fell apart. People ran for cover. The parties themselves were separated. Some groups broke apart. The captain had said that he would wait till all the festivities were over until he would reboard and go back to Red Wing and retrace his steps. But instead, he was looking at the situation and realizing several things. He had some young women aboard, all escorted, but still he couldn't take the chance, to his way of thinking, of not going back upriver. It could have been a disgrace for these young women if they would have been left overnight without proper chaperoning. That was part of his figuring. I think the other feeling in his mind, anyway, he was an experienced boatman, was he could make the trip. At this point, he decided to sound the ship's whistle and recall his passengers. Not everyone could hear this. People were inside from taking cover from the storm. Lake City had a number of buildings unroofed. It was more badly damaged than Red Wing. There were people walking around dazed in Lake City. But nonetheless, the captain said, "We will go back upriver." So he recalled the passengers. And we later determined, about 215 people were on board. It's important to note it was all a heavily male population. There were only 57 women and girls on board. Again, we're talking about chaperoning, proper proprieties. It was a Sunday. Some people were told not to go on the Sabbath, not to go on this trip. So there were a lot of factors mitigating against women being on board. But despite people saying to the captain right in the Lake City dock, don't go, others said, well, let's go. So off they went. He headed north and cut across Lake Pepin and hugged kind of the Wisconsin shore and was heading along towards Maiden Rock when he saw heavy winds coming off the Minnesota shore. And a good boatman was going to turn into a wind, and he turned in and started moving across the lake, Lake Pepin, when the winds really started to blow. Now, there are questions, and I deal with this in the book, about whether the women on board were ordered into the cabin or whether they went there themselves. I'm pretty sure, logic would tell me, with all the wind and rain, and these women wearing probably their Sunday best, literally, most of them had gone into the cabin. Some were still on the barge. But as the boat continues, people were starting to get nervous. The weather was just heavier. The waves were coming up. People on the barge started to think, if we have trouble here, we have to get free of this boat. It could roll over on us. And there were reports that one man took an axe and tried to cut the lines loose between the two craft. And other people were wrestling with the lines to get the barge loose. I'm not sure that they were ever able to do that. I think, as I've reconstructed it, the movement of the barge and the boat separated the barge from the boat, and it drifted away. And this is right around 8 o'clock, and as it's moving, around 8:30 I should say, as it's moving away, lightning hits, the winds get heavier, the Seawing starts rocking, and you'd think a flat-bottomed steamboat would be pretty safe from getting turned over. They said, they used to say you could run a steamboat on dew. They could go on really shallow water. But it was rocking, and the people on the barge saw the Seawing go about 45 degrees, really unusual in the waves. And as it reached there, it paused for a second, and then it rolled right over, right all the way upside down. And let's remember the people in the cabin. They are thrust upside down in Lake Pepin, underneath the boat. They're standing shoulder to shoulder in the cabin, and they didn't have a chance to survive. They were all drowned. This is a hideous thing. Meanwhile, there's problems with the people who were on the rigging of the boat and outside on the decks, thrown into the water and struggling to survive. The barge, fortunately, for some of the people who were new to the area, knew Central Point, they realized they were pretty close to shallow water, and a couple of young men hopped out into the water, ran to Lake City, and that was quite a jog, to alarm the town and get some help out to the lake. The Lake City story is going to be told better, I think, we'll have more time in the new book, and also the video that's going to be, I'm going to talk about a little bit later. Some incredibly heroic young men took rowboats out onto the lake, and by now they said the hail that was coming down with chicken-sized egg hail, they went out anyway, and they did rescue a couple of people. But it soon became evident there weren't any survivors at the accident scene. The National Guard was alerted, and they took control. They came into Lake City, got people out there. By around midnight, they were organized. The boat had turned on its side as it kind of drifted downriver, got in the shallows around Central Point. It flipped on its side. There were about 30 people on the bottom, on the flat bottom, including the captain. Just an aside, the captain had his wife and 2 young sons on board, kind of a family trip. And, of course, he didn't know where they were, and like so many people who had been separated already by the accident, just that tension about where's my family, where's my friends, my wife, my children. He was thrown in the water and managed to get to shore safely. the National Guard organized the Ethel Howard, which was got control of the Ethel Howard from the captain, a Lake City man who was a little reluctant to go out right away. He thought he might add more bodies into the water. And they used that boat and the Jim Grant they put the Jim Grant up next to the wreckage of the Seawing. And now the Seawing is on its side, and they start looking for bodies. They were still looking for bodies in the water, mind you, but they knew they had bodies in the cabin, and they started chopping holes in the cabin and slowly took bodies out. We were fortunate that there was a Pioneer Press reporter on the scene, actually, and reported the bodies being taken out, put on the Ethel Howard, and by late in the evening, they thought they had as many as they could take. There were 52 bodies on this steamboat, and they were brought to the Red Wing levee. And you can imagine the scene at Red Wing. The people had been aware by this time. The people on the boat aren't back. They learned from a person who was on a train coming through that there had been an accident. So there were a lot of people at the levee. And none of them knew if their loved ones had survived. There's no way of knowing. So the first inclination are the bodies. So they're walking through the bodies and looking to see. And it's just a horrendous scene. The bodies are taken to the local Red Wing undertaker, who is quickly overwhelmed and ends up farming out most of this work to the Red Wing Furniture Company, Matthias Kaiser and his sons. They start dealing with the bodies. If you can imagine this, but maybe one of the most surprising, stunning things to me when I think back about the Seawing disaster is the accident is ongoing. There are still people missing. They have now figured by Monday afternoon that there's approximately 100 people missing. And it's not quite that many, but that's what they thought. But back to Red Wing and the bodies. On Tuesday, Red Wing had 44 funerals. It was a town of 6,000 then. The funerals started during the day and went all day long out to the German Lutheran cemetery, the Catholic cemetery, and Oakwood. So, to me, the people said Red Wing was a town in mourning. It was in shock and in mourning. And it wasn't over. They still had people missing. At the lake, they were trying to bring up the bodies. National Guard actually fired cannonballs into the water, trying to stir up bodies, and dropped dynamite charges into the water, trying to stir up bodies. Unsuccessfully. Finally, on Wednesday, late Wednesday, nature started helping, and bodies started surfacing. And then these bodies were taken to Central Point, laid out. Red Wing and Lake City officials had organized. They had coffins waiting. They had ice waiting, so the bodies were put in the coffins and then shipped back to Red Wing again. So by Thursday, the last person has been recovered. The reports were 99 were dead, but they had one woman counted it with their maiden name and married name. So 98 people have been killed. So there you have the story of one of Minnesota's and one of America's worst inland waterway disasters. And to me, when I started researching this, I was looking to do a magazine article, and I went to Minnesota Historical Society and discovered they had one memorial booklet. They didn't even have the Seawing disaster indexed. There was no information. What had happened is, to bring a note of levity to this grim situation, my Aunt Mae Johnson explained this to me just with an offhand comment. When I told her I was working on the Seawing disaster, she said, "Why? Everybody knows about it." And everybody in Red Wing did, of her age. The story, the disaster, is so localized that only the people here knew about it. There was no point in writing about it. The newspapers from all across the country, the New York Times covered it. It had been covered extensively in the Twin Cities papers and the local papers, but the story was known. And when I was starting to research in the 1980s, it was amazing. There was just rumors left. In a way, I was getting the sense that it's time to do a new edition, because I'm thinking it's starting to get lost again. The story's starting to get lost again, and we certainly don't want that. I want to talk about the new book and the new project, and I'm going to start by making you a part of the unveiling of the proposed dust jacket for the new book. My wife, besides being an art teacher, is a very good, and an editor, is also a good designer. She's designed several book jackets now, and I'm going to again release it from its captivity in the ceremonial bag. Which one? The first one? Oh, it's this one. All right, I got it. Here it is. I'll show it around and I'll leave it up. For those of you familiar with the book, this is the picture that was taken by Red Wing photographer James Kellogg in the background, all those photographs. When the accident happened, he advertised in the Red Wing paper for photos of the lost, as he said, and he got photos, carefully arranged them. So, like if it was a family picture, the people who died were shown, and the people who are still alive were, of course, not shown. This photo, let me see right up here. This photo, right where my index finger is Nellie Weathern, the captain's wife. The captain lost his wife and youngest son, Pearlie. And when I saw this photo, it just was so interesting to me, because I realized that from her age, she was in her early 30s, that no doubt the captain, David Weathern, would have been in this picture. I just was wishing I could get that photo. And after the book came out, the Weathern family, members of them from California, had learned about the book, and they sent the whole picture. So the whole picture is in the second edition. And of course, down here we have the actual boat. It doesn't look very big to have 215 people on board, and it really wasn't. Well, I'll put this up here. Thank you, man. That's what I needed that, I guess. The idea of doing a new book came to me about 10, 15 years ago, and then we were talking about doing it right about the time we hit the Great Recession, and the society kind of backed away at that time, and I was on doing other things. So we came back just recently and decided that it was time to do a new book. And a lot of developments have happened. I mentioned one of them. We have a picture of the captain at the time of the accident. We have a picture of the boat as it was towing the barge at the time of the accident. And we've identified some photos that were thought to be Seawing, and we've been able to prove that they are the Seawing. And I'm finding things every day. This past week, I was at Minnesota Historical Society, and I decided I would go through company histories of Minnesota National Guard, hoping to find some written documents. And I found this kind of like a yearbook with advertisements and photos. I found a couple of photos of people, like the guy who did the dynamiting. Found his photo, so I got a copy of that. But the photo I'm really excited about is of Camp Lakeview. It was taken by one of the guardsmen, and he had taken two photos. He had just taken a photo the day before from a bluff looking down at it, and then he took a photo the day after. I never had even heard of such a photo, so we have that now. So you get a sense of exactly what the camp looked like at the time of the disaster, where the tents were, and you can see the damage to the company street where things just seem to be blown away. And I have new accounts. One of the guardsmen talking about the mess tent being blown in the air and dropping back on the people below in a sodden mess. And then their reaction, how they learned about the Seawing and how they rushed to the scene and, of course, worked so valiantly first to save people and then to recover the bodies. As I said, I was concerned about this being a lost story. It's a compelling story, and it's one I don't want to really mess with. So what we're planning on doing, I should just give you the outlines of the book. It will be a larger book. It'll be hardcover. It'll be 40 to 50% longer. We'll have a lot more photos. We'll also be able to, if you looked at the old book, like I have so many times, when you're reading about someone who's drowned, like the Gherkin family, he was a saloon owner in Red Wing. He and his wife and 6 children all drowned. So when I wanted to look on the photo for people, I would have to look for the number, because all these photos are numbered, and then you can find out who is who. So we now, of course, have the ability with scanning techniques to scan not only that whole photo and get a much better resolution, you can go in and take individuals off of here. And these are good photos because almost everybody in 1890 had their pictures taken in the studio. It's not brownies or Polaroids for sure. So it's one of the Gherkins right up here. You know, it's just a really great picture. I know most of these. Over the years, you go back through them. I was talking to Dick Bach about the Steiger sisters, and that story keeps getting added to. I did not have access to Casper Cap Haustein's version of the Seawing Disaster. Cap Haustein was on the boat and was one of the people that didn't hear the recall from after the disaster. He was down at Lake City. He raced back to the shoreline in a carriage with some other people, was signaling with a lantern to the Seawing, trying to get them to turn around and come back and pick him up. And I guess luckily for him they didn't. But the Steiger sisters were among several Steigers, several sisters. I mentioned our family's relation to the Persig family, and those 2 young women who were on the Seawing on a date. And the Steiger story is interesting to me, and like I said, it keeps getting larger, because Tilly Steiger gave me an interview in the early 1980s. She was, I thought, really old then, you know. What did I know, 1980s, but old. But she was in her 80s and really sharp, and she described the sky, and I put it in the book, you know, the sky. But so did Cap Haustein. He talked about you felt like you could touch the clouds. They were just oppressive. And Cap was related to the Steigers, and I forget how. Or just a friend, perhaps?
No, there was a relationship, but it went back a ways. I'm not sure how things were related.
Yeah, so in the Steigers case, the 2 women were with these, they called them railroad men. If you worked for the railroad, you were a railroad man. And the boat was there to take them with them. And they tried to save the sisters. They were with them, they held on to them. The last grasp they had were of their hair, and they couldn't hold them. Tilly Steiger Metzler told me about that day when the railroad men came to tell the family what had happened, and how her father, when he would come in from the fields, would always look at the pictures of the girls, and he never got over it. And that's a repeating theme of the Seawing Disaster. I discovered over and over again. It was just such a scarring situation. So I keep tying more information into the book I think, the things that make the story come alive. I should mention, I don't know if any of you have read E.L. Doctorow's stuff. He did Ragtime and a few other novels. And he was asked to explain the difference between writing historical accounts and writing nonfiction histories. And he said, the historian will tell you what happened, and the novelist, will tell you what it felt like. And I think a narrative historian, and I try to write narrative history all the time. So the books that Amy were talking about, the Goodhue County history, I'm proud to say, has been called the model for other Minnesota history societies to follow, is up here. I got paid for writing the book. I don't get any royalties, so I'm just telling you, it's a good book. And it's got stuff. I was talking to Tom Brown, telling him stuff about his great uncle, Tom is way in the back, that he didn't know, and it's in the book. And also papers from a relative from his relative who was a congressman are here, and I've read them. So the point is, when you're telling history, I prefer not to tell it. I prefer to show it to you and let you look at it and let the story tell itself. So I'm not going to go back and rip the book apart, the old book. We'll use the body of the book, but where I have new information, like on the company, the destruction of the company street at Camp Lakeview, I'll put that in. And if we find any errors, heaven forbid, but there's always errors, we'll be able to make changes. Again, I think that's the real positive aspect of this new book. We can also make it just more attractive. We can use color now, when color used to be so expensive. We're going to have color throughout the book. When we went to the cemeteries and took photos, you actually get that feeling, the lichen on the old stones and the legends. So we're always looking for the date, by the way, because oftentimes, like at the German Lutheran, the stones are all in German. So you just see July 13th and you know you're on the right track. I think that through this introduction of brand new photos, things that haven't been seen before, a further study of the weather at the time, and then finishing with an epilogue of material that is totally new and new in interpretation. The book will be what I always intend with my history is to be fully contextual. Right now, the Seawing is a very narrow story. I mean, it's a week-long story. And because of that, I feel the additional context that I can add will make the story that much more meaningful. I know it's really warm, and you've been a really attentive audience. Are there any questions I can answer about the Seawing for you, or the concept of the new book? Yes?
When's it coming out?
We should have it out this summer. Bob Norberg is way in the back, and Bob is from Lake City. He is, I'm going to mention now a little more about the video. He is working with Ben Thranen, who used to be a KSTP photographer, TV guy, to produce a video of the Seawing Disaster. And I'm helping him with the scripting of it. But I think that'll be out this summer too, and that will be something very worthwhile. They've done other work, and I know they're very good. Yes?
Yes, John Marcus from Diamond Bluff. One of the things that I've been finding in some studies of the Seawing was it was rebuilt in 1894. Do you have any pictures of the new versus the old?
No, I'm hoping, if you've heard that there have been several collections, we were talking about the reward collection, but at Winona, there's a new steamboat photo collection that I heard about, and it's like 5-6 years ago. I'm hoping to find another photo there. It's an interesting story. The captain he's a practical man. He has the hull of the Seawing. It's just the top has been blown off. He can rebuild on that or sink it. I mean, so he decides to rebuild the boat. And then, his plan is, I've got to change the name. But the hull is registered, and back in those days, I don't know if it still works that way. I bet the captain back then. So that he can't change the name. He writes to his congressman and talks about the unfortunate accident, and he wants to name it the P.F. Ritchie. The captain was put on trial, as some of you know from the book, and was found guilty of negligence. But P.F. Ritchie was a captain who backed him and said he was a good boatman. But as we get back to the Seawing, he decides, well, I can't rename it. I'm going to rebuild it, and I'll run it as the Seawing. And that's what he did until about 1903 or 4 when it was sold for scrap. I wonder sometimes what people in Red Wing, if they're down at the levee and the Seawing goes by, the town was, as I said, scarred by this whole incident. At the time, the feelings were mixed about the captain. There were people ready to lynch him. I mean, he was we're talking about this with one of the audience members about him telling the people, the guardsmen, stop chopping holes in my boat. He didn't want to see it destroyed. And at that time, his wife still hadn't been found. Which reminds me, I better hit that important point. I mentioned to you about the women on board, and I should not neglect to tell you that of the 57 women and girls, only 7 survived. It was an absolutely horrific thing. The newspaperman describing the bodies, my great-grandfather telling my great-uncle about the bodies. I didn't mention that my great-grandfather, a Swedish immigrant who had worked in the stables of the King of Sweden, was a teamster. And he was one of the men who drove a stone boat down to the levee and put bodies on them. Stone boats were used by farmers in fields and also in mining in limestone bluffs. So they were really low slung. So the bodies were placed on boats like that. Some other wagons came. So the people walked alongside. What else are you going to do? They just walked alongside the bodies. They went up Plum Street. How steep Plum Street is. The landing was at Plum Street at that time. And down Main Street to the funeral parlors, which again, of course, that didn't work well. They ended up at the furniture company. And a vote of thanks for Matthias Kaiser and his sons, who spent every waking hour for 3 days working on coffins. Another amazing story. Other questions? Yes?
I was wondering, my great-grandfather was a survivor of the Seawing. I was wondering if you did much of the background or history on the survivors.
I didn't. I really focused on the story. What was his name?
Oscar Berlin.
Oh, we have up in the case here at Goodhue County Historical Society, what did he float down? He ended up at Reed's Landing, right?
That's what I heard.
Yeah, that seems like a long way, but that's what I had heard too. Some people actually ended up on the Wisconsin shore. Very strange. I was able, if you want to see something interesting sometime here at the Minnesota Historical Society, besides the coroner's records for Goodhue County and Red Wing, all sorts of criminal records up at the Historical Society. It kind of gets engrossing. But John Kylo, the coroner, wrote 98 into the coroner's book, 98 individual coroner's reports. And it was kind of, it's handwritten, and I copied some, so we'll have them in the new book so you get a sense of them. And it was kind of boilerplate until something unusual would happen, like the girl who was turned over to the Lake City officials because she had relatives in Stockholm, Wisconsin. And other than that, he says essentially they drowned. They had no evidence of damage to their, no criminal acts had been committed. He was convinced of that. And that was even the case when I looked for sure to see the G.A. Carlson's son, Joe Carlson. G.A. Carlson was a kiln operator in Red Wing, and the acting mayor, his son, was the second to the last body found, and his son's body was badly disfigured. The coroner's report did not mention that. It just said it was the same as the rest of them. So, I didn't learn that much unless it was something very unusual. But I kind of went around your question. I didn't spend much time on the survivors, and except the ones who made reports diaries or kind of stories that filter down, you have lots of stories that you just can't put in. One of my aunts talked about, well, I know they cut off fingers of the people to get their rings. Well, what she had heard actually was partially factual. John Peterson was a body that was found that couldn't be identified. He had a ring on his hand, and they cut off the ring, not the finger. They got the ring off, and there was an inscription inside, and through that they were able to identify him. Some of the bodies were in very, very poor condition by the time they were brought back.
Yeah, Fred?
Yes.
Wally Yerson from Dan Bluff. I live in Captain Weather's house in Dan Bluff. And it was haunted. Believe it or not, but it only affected the girls, ever.
That's interesting. The Diamond Bluff Cemetery is interesting too.
My wife passed away from cancer 13 years ago. And she said, "Come on, Captain, I'm taking you with me." I haven't heard from you since.
For those in the back, guy up here lives in Captain Weathern's house. If you go to the Diamond Bluff Cemetery, there used to be a stone that had DNW, David Niles Weathern, next to the Weathern family stone, and that wasn't there the last time I went to check it out.
Another thing, when we moved there in '48, my father was a commercial fisherman, and there was below his house they pumped sand in twice, and there was a skeleton of a boat there, fairly large boat. So I don't know if that had anything to do with that same one.
Yeah, we talked about a skeleton of a boat they found right at Diamond Bluff. Later, I'm not sure about that. I do know the engines were sold, and it's possible that they just tried to.
The Lee Miller had the bell off it, and he was the local.
And that's up in the museum now. Is that the?
I don't know.
There's one up there, the Seawing Bell, up in the museum here.
Okay, maybe that's where it went then.
One thing about bodies I was mentioning, most of the people had their loved ones laid out in the living room, which was kind of the tradition. There was no funeral parlors, so the funereal process was a little different. And some of the stories in the book, and I wish there were more, are pretty gruesome when you think about these people. Poor people had to have their relatives, or like in one case, Minnie Fisher, laid out, and she had a big gash across her forehead. She'd been hit by something, and that's just one of the stories you hear, which reminds me again, I wish more people would have written down stories like that. But other questions? Yes?
What happened to the barge and the people on the barge?
The barge drifted ashore, and everybody except Ole Oski, one guy who jumped off and drowned, everybody got to shore safely. So the women survivors were almost all on the barge. And one or two women were picked up by the first Lake City rowboat that got out to the accident scene. Yes?
Where was this Camp Lakeview located?
Down by Eagle, what's the place, the art gallery thing?
Wild Wing.
Wild Wing.
And Sportsman's Club down there.
It's a kind of flat land. I think you'll recognize it from the pictures when you see them, where it is. The Lake City tie is really, really important, and that's why I'm so glad the Lake City guys are working on the video. One of the things I put in the script for the video, but it bears repeating, was the message written and spoken to during the memorial service in Red Wing that was held 10 days after the accident. Thousands of people in Central Park. And it was so heartfelt about the people who risked their lives and also the people who took the dead from Red Wing in. And it bound Red Wing and Lake City together for quite a while. It's an interesting relationship. There was a special memorial. We have pictures of the memorial service, that special memorial the Lake Cityans brought with them. And they were given honored spots, city officials. The mayor of Lake City spoke, and the city attorney, Kenny, spoke at the Red Wing Central Park Memorial. So that's something else we'll be exploring too. I think it's a very interesting story.
Did the captain charge each individual for the trip, or it must have been a money-making proposition?
It was. The cost was 50 cents, and he had a crew of 10, and it was almost all family members. His co-owner, Mel Sparks, and her sons, most of the Diamond Buff people, like the Merrows, were related to people on the crew, the Niles family as well. And they charged 50 cents. One of the crewmen took that fee when people got on board. Linus Lindblad from the prominent Lindblad family was a 10-year-old who helped load ice, helped Captain Weather get ice on the boat before it left the levee. So he said, "You can have a free ride." He didn't check with his family, and he got on the boat, and he was among those who drowned. And think about that family who thought, where's our son? First of all, could he have been on the boat? It's just another horrible picture that comes to mind.
Fred, the actual capsizing of the boat, you mentioned Central Point a couple of times. Mm-hmm. Is that the location of the capsize?
No, the location is up, and Captain...
Right there by the where the Highway 61 rest area is, about 1,200 feet out.
Yeah, it's up farther because it rolled over and then it drifted upside down a bit and then hit, some of the shallower water and rolled over. Remarkable photos from 1890. You can see they've got pictures of the guys working out on the boat. It's in the first edition of the Seawing, which has been out of print for a long time, and the picture of the barge itself being used as base of the National Guard to take bodies off and salvage what they could from the Seawing is just a wonderful picture.
In the baggie.
Oh. Let's hear it for the wife. All right. While I'm talking about this, I should mention, people love to hear about the Seawing disaster. I'm always promoting books I've written, and they know if they've heard about it, they say, "Can you tell us about that?" So I've given a lot of talks on the Seawing disaster, and usually in much smaller groups. This picture of the upper left-hand corner shows, I'll leave these out if you want to come see them. It's in the second edition of the Seawing disaster. It shows the Seawing with the barge Jim Grant and how it looked at the time that it rolled over. And there's a picture of Captain Weathern, 1926 newspaper article over in the right-hand corner. His son, Roy Weather, became a famous Mississippi River boatman. He made the comment that after the accident, his father went on living, he said, but it was years before I saw him smile again. And I can understand that. He never served any kind of sentence. They said they were going to suspend his license, the steamboat inspectors, but they did not. And he just kept operating the boat. Other questions? Yes.
I've got your original book here, which I'll have you sign.
Sure.
But I was looking at the picture of the life preserver. What was the controversy with that? Were there enough life preservers, or were they just not available to people at the time?
The life preservers actually looked to be like a real case against the captain. And actually, he had certified lifesavers. They were not very good. Some were made of tool or kind of bulrushes, this lightweight material they thought would help people out. So at first it appeared that the captain would be in trouble because of the lifesavers, and it turned out that he wasn't. You can see them in the photo. Maybe it's in this one. The photo I'm talking about, Donna, is the one that has the barge next to it. It's this one. That photo. And in that picture, you can see life jackets. It's in that book.
Is there one here in the museum?
There is one in the museum. It's right up in the case on the first floor. You can see it. It says Seawing right on it. It's a touching story that I found out. H.W. Keller of Hay Creek lost his niece, Eliza Crawford, on the Seawing, and he was right. She was from Ohio. She was teaching down by Kenyon and was lost on the Seawing, and she her body wasn't found, and he was writing to them. So we have the letters here at Goodhue County Historical Society, and they were sent to me shortly after the book came out. They talked about the hats.